Hey guys, we are back talking about Hell's Kitchen, and today we will be doing a chef ranking for season 2, ranking all 12 chefs from the season based on how well I think they played during the game. And I thought this was a pretty interesting list. There are definitely some interesting placements, but we'll get to that more in a moment. But there are 12 chefs to talk about, and let's not waste any more time. Let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 12, the chef I believe performed the worst during the season is Polly, the first boot of the season. And I feel like the show did a much better job at explaining why Polly was the first boot here compared to season 1, where I feel like Polly was clearly the worst chef of the season. Right at the bat, she has a really bad signature dish to the point where Gordon doesn't even take a bite of it. She then explains that she doesn't have any professional experience, which I feel like just laid the groundwork for her failure in the future. And we see this all play out during the service, where she's put on appetizers but completely fails at it, where others have to help her, but even then she still screws up several dishes. And it got so bad that she got kicked off the station and Gordon called her a donkey. Again, all of it's pretty bad, and I feel like the show did a much better job at explaining why she was the first boot compared to Carol Ann. I feel like with all that, she's clearly the worst chef of the season, which is why she's here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and I actually had this person one spot higher when I first put this list together, but after thinking about it, I just couldn't justify it. But we're actually breaking away from the boot order, and here we have Tom. And obviously Tom has a bit of longevity. He does make it to episode 4, which is definitely further than several chefs we'll be talking about more soon. But I also feel like he was such a terrible chef during his time there and just made a bevy of mistakes. Right at the bat, he obviously has a bad signature dish that Gordon ends up spitting out. We also have him being called up for his sweating. And all this just leads into his service, where service 1's pretty bad. A fire breaks out in his station. A customer also sends back his risotto at one point. Again, all of it's pretty bad, but his team ends up winning the service, so whatever. Service 2 is also pretty bad, where he ends up getting nominated after his team loses the service, but he's spared over Gabe. Episode 3 is also pretty bad, where he ends up using an old tortellini during the challenge rather than making one from scratch, and he also gets into an argument with Gordon at one point. Again, bad look. But even beyond that, he also has a pretty bad service there, gets nominated again, and he somehow stays over Giacomo, which is pretty insane. And then obviously in service 4, he's pretty bad on the meat station, doesn't communicate with his team, makes several big mistakes, and he's finally eliminated at that point. So while he definitely makes it further than some chefs we'll be talking about more in a moment, I feel like he made a lot more mistakes during his time on the show, and Gordon just kept on giving him more chances until it just became too much. So I feel like for all those reasons, I can't really have Tom too much higher than number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and we're actually going back in the boot order a bit, and here we have Gabe. And I feel like Gabe is another pretty bad chef, where his main pro is in episode 1, where he gets to taste Garrett's signature dish, and he correctly calls it overdone, which obviously builds some favor with Gordon, but then immediately follows it up with his own bad signature dish, where he puts up raw fish. Again, pretty bad look there. Now, admittedly, his service 1 isn't too bad, where his main mistake is being too slow on a Wellington, but he follows it up with a pretty bad service 2, where he has a lot of trouble with communication, and obviously that's pretty bad. Now, admittedly, I don't think he should have been eliminated over Giacomo or Tom, as I feel like those two made more mistakes during their services. And I feel like in a lot of ways, he was eliminated more for shock value, where obviously he was the first chef to ever be eliminated after Gordon had nominated him. So I feel like that's a slight pro in that he wasn't actually nominated by his team, but it's still pretty bad that he annoyed Gordon that much to where Gordon decided to make an example out of him. And I think considering the lack of pros in Gabe's game, I did decide to leave him here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we're moving on to the next boot on the board, and here we have Giacomo. And I feel like there's a serious debate for Giacomo being below Gabe, as I feel like he made more mistakes during his run. Where obviously in service 2 makes a pretty bad mistake by allowing bad cabbage to get through dishes, which is a big reason why he is nominated there. And while I think he would have stayed over Tom had this been a normal round, I still think that's a pretty bad mistake there. And he obviously follows it up in service 3, where he doesn't have the oven on, which is pretty dumb. He obviously ends up screwing up the duck at multiple points. Gordon even switches him to a different station at one point, and he's obviously eliminated at that point. So I think that's a pretty big knock to his game. And again, I did consider having him below Gabe, but I feel like there are 2 reasons why I didn't. One is that even if episode 3 had been a normal round, I think Tom would have gone over Giacomo. But I think the other thing is, Jocko at least had an okay signature dish. Like, he didn't put up raw fish like Gabe did. So I feel like that slight pro was enough to have him over Gabe, to where I have him here at number 9. Now moving on to number 9, and we have the earliest boot left on the board, and here we have Larry. And I straight up didn't know what to do with Larry. There was definitely a point where I had him second to last, just above Polly at one point. As if we are looking at his game, I mean, the show doesn't really give him much of anything positive, where obviously he has a bad signature dish, and he doesn't really shine in any regard. And a lot of that is due to him being sick, to where he's obviously pulled from the game in episode 2. You also have the fact that in episode 2, during the cutting challenge, he has 0 good cuts, which is pretty bad. But again, I feel like at the end of the day, he doesn't make any massive mistakes during his service, unlike the players we already talked about. I feel like those players made more active mistakes than Larry. And then plus, I feel like with him being pulled from the game due to his illness, I feel like that at least kind of excuses his poor performance here. And I feel like mixing that with the lack of really big mistakes during a service, I did decide to give him the benefit of the doubt for this list, which is why he is here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and I did debate these next two, as I feel like one of these players has a more noticeable downfall compared to the other one, whereas I feel like the other one has lower highs. So I did debate that to a degree, but I did decide to go with the player with lower highs at the end of the day, even though this person did technically make it further. And here we have Maribel. And I am a bit conflicted about Maribel's run here, where I feel like a lot of what we see on the show highlights her weaknesses. Throughout the bad episode 1, she has a bad signature dish, so bad that Gordon spits it out. But beyond that, like, she does fine during the first service. She doesn't really make much mistakes there. Same thing with episode 2. She does kind of just fine during that service. But then we get to service 3, which is pretty terrible, where she was on the meat station there, and she just made a ton of dumb mistakes. Like, she just screwed up Wellington after Wellington, which ended up causing a customer to walk out. And we even see Gordon calling her out, thinking that she gives up too easily. And I feel like had the red team lost that service, she definitely would have gone up and potentially gone home in that situation. But again, they win the service, so whatever. Service 4 is just kind of fine, but then service 5, she makes some pretty notable mistakes there, like having a hair falling in her dish, and she also gets into an argument with Gordon that results in her being nominated, but she ends up staying there. And then we get to her boot round, where while she does make several mistakes on her own, I feel like Virginia and Sarah are more responsible for that team's loss, where they were behind the menu, and they also made plenty of mistakes there. And she isn't even nominated, where instead Gordon is the one who eliminated her due to her not being much of a leader there. So I'm kind of conflicted about Maribel's overall run here, where in some ways you could say that she didn't make as many mistakes as other players, particularly in our boot round, but I feel like they're just lower highs on the whole. Like, I feel like there was never a point during the season where I feel like she was doing particularly well or particularly dominating the season. She also got homesick at several points, which I think also harmed her performance. So I think on the whole, Maribel is just kind of mediocre in my eyes, which is a big reason why I went with her lower than the other person. So because of that, I do have her here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and this may be controversial that I have her above Maribel, but I feel like this person has higher highs. And here we have Rachel. Now obviously Rachel has a pretty notable downfall here, where she has a pretty strong beginning to her season, where while she doesn't get much screen time during the first 3 episodes, she has pretty solid services across all 3 of them, doesn't really make any mistakes during those services, and by episode 4, we even see Gordon calling her this emerging leader, and that causes her to be seen as the leader of the red team moving forward. But this is also the point where she has a pretty massive downfall, where service 4 is terrible for her, where she just screws up dish after dish, and it gets to the point where she even volunteers for the block after her team loses the challenge. And while she doesn't end up going up on the block, I feel like that reflects poorly on her as a player and her desire to win. And then service 5 is just more the same. She has a duck catching on fire at one point. Again, she just screws up tons of dishes there. Gordon tells her to get a grip, but she just continues to screw up. And then she's eventually put up and eliminated in episode 5. Again, it's a pretty massive and noticeable downfall from the point where Gordon called her a leader, which I think is pretty interesting there, but also tough to assess, as obviously she has a bigger fall compared to Maribel. Whereas I feel like Maribel is more so just a long string of mediocrity, and I feel like there is a serious debate for Maribel being above Rachel. But the reason I went with Rachel over Maribel is I feel like her highs are higher than Maribel's. again, those first three services were solid for her, to where Gordon did consider her a leader to begin with. So I feel like with that, I feel like Rachel had more potential during the rest of the season compared to Maribel. And while she does screw it up, I feel like that potential was there, whereas Gordon literally eliminated Maribel for her lack of leadership. So I feel like for all those reasons, I did decide to give Rachel the edge, which is why she's here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and we are down to the people who made the black jackets, and it's just a matter of ordering them. By number 5, we have the person who came in 5th place, and here we have Garrett. And I feel like similar to Rachel, Garrett has a pretty solid start to the season, where while his signature dish is pretty bad, I feel like his first 3 services are pretty good, even winning himself a best of the worst during service 2. And while we see him making sexist remarks against the female players, it's really not until service 4 that we really start to see him making mistakes. Where obviously his service 4 is pretty bad. He makes several pretty big mistakes there, like not tasting a dish and serving cold spaghetti that the customer sends back. But obviously he's able to escape nomination there. Service 5 also isn't great, where he has a lot of trouble communicating and he runs out of quail at one point and he thinks Heather is making him look bad. But again, he's able to scrape through that. Episode 6 is also pretty bad for him, where this is the point where he flips off Gordon and the red team during the punishment, which gets on their nerves. He also doesn't have much input in the menu that they put together for that service. And the service itself is pretty bad, where he makes tons of mistakes on the meat station. Heather has to jump in and bail him out. And while they win the service, we see Gordon calling him lucky that he had Heather and Keith on his team, as he probably would have gone home had they lost that service. And then we get to the Black Jackets, where he obviously is eliminated at that first round due to him serving raw chicken. And while that seems to be the main reason he is eliminated at that point, I feel like he probably doesn't win the season even if he does survive that round. Where by that point he had already had several bad services, and with him getting on Gordon's nerves and with him being a clear misogynist, I find it unlikely that he actually gets to the end and wins, even if he didn't make that mistake. But he still did solid enough during the first half of the season to where I at least had him this high on the list, but I feel like 5 is about as high as I can put him. Now moving on to number 4, and we have a very interesting player to talk about, as while this person did come close to winning, I find their performance to be pretty lackluster, and we actually have Virginia, the runner-up of the season. And again, Virginia is the runner-up. She did make it to the end, but I feel like as a runner-up, she played a pretty abysmal game where she was just constantly in danger throughout most of the season, and I feel like there are very few merits to her game to justify her being higher on this list. Where right off the bat, she has a pretty bad service 1. There's even a point where she has to go over to the blue team and then asks them for lamb stock, which is pretty embarrassing. And she is nominated at the first elimination of the season, which I think is a pretty bad indictment on her game. But again, she ends up staying there. Service 2 is also pretty bad, where Gordon literally calls her lucky to be there and then proceeds to make several pretty bad mistakes, like telling Gordon that a bad tortellini was good enough to serve in her restaurant, and she probably would have been nominated had they lost that service. And then we get to service 4 the next time the red team loses the challenge, and she is nominated again for having another bad service, where again she just screws up dish after dish. Gordon even accuses her of sabotaging her team at one point, which is pretty bad. She does turn it around in episode 5, where she does pretty well at the blind taste test, getting 3 out of 4 there. And then she does pretty well at the service to where she ends up winning best of the worst, which is pretty insane there. But then after that, she's right back at the bottom, where she ends up having a pretty infamous streak where she is nominated the next 4 services in a row. Where in service 6, she has this sashimi on the menu, even though she doesn't really know how to cook fish, and she ends up putting up a raw dish at one point, which is pretty bad. Service 7, she's pretty bad on the garnishes. She even campaigns to Keith at one point to not nominate her, but is unsuccessful there. And then we get to service 8, the final 4, where she ends up winning a challenge that guarantees her a spot in the final 3, but she ends up doing so poorly at the service that Gordon takes away the immunity, and she really spirals from that point on. She literally goes around feeling like she doesn't deserve to win, and she's just fine going up on the block, feeling like she doesn't deserve to stay, until Gordon decides to honor his promise of giving her a spot in the final 3 if she wants it, and she does kind of fumble around for a bit before eventually taking it. But still, that one round is so terrible for her, where she literally had a guaranteed spot in the final 3, and almost goes home in the spot due to how bad she performed at that service. And then we get to the final three where she wins the reward of getting one-on-one training with Gordon, but then follows it up with another pretty terrible service that results in her being nominated by both Heather and Keith, and she just stays over Keith being a pretty bad leader, not so much because she's a better chef than him. And while she does fine enough during the final service, I feel like Heather was such a clear frontrunner that it was essentially Heather's game to lose more so than Virginia's to win. So all in all, I find her game to be pretty bad, where she was nominated at almost every single elimination she was eligible for, being nominated 6 times over the course of the season, and the only time she wasn't nominated was the one time she won Best of the Worst, and then the 2 services that her team won. So I feel like mixing that in with how bad she performed towards the tail end of the game, I can't really have her too much higher, despite the fact that she did come in second place. So because of that, I do have her here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and we have someone who didn't do as well as Virginia, but I feel like they were better across the season, and here we have Sarah. And I think the thing about Sarah is kind of similar to Rachel. She's one of these chefs that has a pretty bad second half to their season that leaves this impression that they're a bad chef, but their first half was actually pretty solid. Now, admittedly, her signature dish was pretty bad right at the start, which isn't great, and even her first service isn't the best. But I think for the first half of the season, she does pretty well, where she does pretty well in a lot of these services here. During service 3, she's even named the best performer from the red team, which is pretty good. And by episode 4, Gordon was starting to see her as his emerging leader on her team. And while she's shown having this power struggle with Rachel over being the leader on their teams, I feel like she does better during service 4 compared to Rachel. But this is also the service where Virginia kind of gets into trouble over a misunderstanding, and Sarah doesn't really stick up for Virginia, which, while it's good that Sarah's able to avoid trouble there, it also paints a target on her back to where Virginia could have easily nominated her at the following service, where Virginia ended up winning Best of the Worst, but is able to avoid that situation. But I feel like from service 6 on, we really start to see Sarah going downhill, where during service 6, she ends up having a really bad service where she just keeps screwing up the lamb dish that she had put on the menu, so much so that Gordon ends up taking it off the menu, which is pretty bad there. She also gets into a fight with Gordon at one point, and all of this is really bad. She ends up getting nominated after this service, but ends up surviving it. Service 7 is also pretty rough, where while she does pretty well at the challenge, she follows it up with a pretty questionable service where she ends up overcooking the scallops, which annoys Gordon, but she's able to avoid nomination there. And then we get to her boot round at the final 4, where she kind of gets unlucky that Virginia has immunity already from winning the challenge, but she still didn't do that great at the service either, where her critics gave her dish mixed reviews. But even so, I feel like she was the next weakest option on the board, considering that Heather and Keith were clearly the better chefs than her, so she probably goes home regardless. But I still think that compared to Virginia, I feel like Sarah was an overall better chef than Virginia. I feel like there were fewer points during the season where she was in danger. And yes, while she kind of falls off towards the tail end, I feel like her first half is largely better than anything Virginia puts up in her first half. So I feel like those factors were enough to have her this high on the list at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and I feel like the top 2 should be pretty obvious, and I feel like the order is also pretty obvious. But number 2, we do have Keith, who came in 3rd place. And I think Keith is clearly one of the 2 best chefs across the season. Now, he does get out to a bit of a rocky start where right off the bat, he has a bad signature dish. He also has Gordon dumping the signature dish into his hat, which is pretty funny. And he also has a pretty mediocre service too, where he's a waiter there and he's kind of slow taking orders. But he very quickly establishes himself as one of the more formidable chefs there, where he doesn't really make any major mistakes during a lot of the season, where we even see by the end of Service 4 that Gordon calls him the only good chef from the blue team. But at the same time, I feel like the major flaw with Keith's game is his lack of leadership skills, where we see during Service 5 that while he does okay enough in the actual service, we see Gordon getting really annoyed by him due to him not stepping up and being a leader. But I feel like he follows it up with 2 pretty good services in a row, where Service 6 is pretty good, and in Service 7 he even wins Best of the Worst. But I feel like he kind of struggles at the final 4, where he has a pretty bad service, makes a couple mistakes like undercooking spaghetti and the critics not really liking his dishes, but he's able to survive that round due to Sarah and Virginia having even worse services than him. And the final 3 is a much better, where his lack of good leadership skills are really put on full display, and that leads to his elimination just short of the end. So I think on the whole, I think Keith is clearly the second best chef of the season, and I feel like he avoids a lot of major mistakes during a lot of services. But at the same time, I mean, his lack of leadership made it so that he probably wasn't going to win by the end, which is obviously an issue. But I feel like compared to Virginia and Sarah, I feel like he's clearly a step above them in terms of his cooking ability and his consistency throughout the season, which is why he's here at number 2. And now at number 1, the best chef from Hell's Kitchen season 2 is Heather West, the winner of the season. And again, I feel like Heather played a pretty solid game for the most part, probably not as dominant as Michael, but I feel like she still does pretty well to where it makes sense why she eventually wins. Right at the bat, she does pretty well in Service 1, winning Best of the Worst. Pretty good stuff there. Service 2 is also pretty good, where while she has to leave in the middle of service due to burning her hand, she does a good job at delegating her service, which it really impresses Gordon with her leadership skills. And I think that's really highlighted in episode 4, where Gordon ends up swapping her to the blue team after calling her an emerging leader. And unlike Rachel, we really see her step up to the plate, where she's able to help the blue team win their first challenge of the season. Service 5 is a bit more rocky, where while she has to take over for Garrett on the meat station, she also makes a couple of mistakes there, and she even tells Gordon after the service that her entire team deserves to be up for elimination. And while this comment ends up annoying people like Keith, she's able to avoid nomination there. But I think she rebounds pretty well the following service, where she once again has a pretty good service. She even takes over for Garrett once again on his station, which is pretty funny. But then she goes right back to having a pretty mediocre service in Service 7, where Gordon even calls her out for being inconsistent and for not working well with Sarah, but she's able to avoid nomination there. And then we get to the final 4, where she does come in last during the challenge, which isn't great, but she follows it up with a pretty good service, all things considered, where while she kind of suffers by other people's mistakes, namely Virginia burning the peas on her dish that went out to the critics, she ends up winning Best of the Worst, and we even see her try to target Virginia at that point, only for Gordon to give Virginia's immunity back. But also say that her endgame isn't great, where I think at the final 3, she kind of just has an okay service, and while she does avoid nomination there, I wouldn't say it's necessarily a fantastic service from a cooking or leadership perspective. And I think her final service isn't great either, where she ends up losing the signature dish challenge, and customers are kind of mixed on her dishes during the actual service, but she's able to pull it out due to her just being an overall better chef than Virginia, even though I think Virginia arguably played the final round better than Heather. So I think on the whole, I'm kind of underwhelmed by Heather's endgame, but I feel like she was clearly better than Virginia during a lot of the season, to where I still probably would have picked Heather to actually win the season by the end of it. And I think in terms of her as a winner, I think she's still a mostly solid winner. I feel like she was largely a strong chef during the season, was never in too much danger of actually going home, though I will say that Michael was a bit more dominant than her, to where I would probably have Michael higher on a winner ranking, but I'm still mostly impressed by Heather, and I feel like she clearly deserved to win the season, which is why she's here at number 1. And there we go, that will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps out the channel. And I'll be back again next week, continuing this series somehow, but I've been enjoying it so far, so you can look forward to that. And again, other general Survivor and reality TV videos coming your way soon. I'm on Patreon now, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description, and you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.